Our guest today is C. Bradley Thompson. Professor Thompson's a research professor at Clemson University in South Carolina, specializes in history, especially intellectual history and political science issues. And he was here today at Rockford College giving a talk on John Adams, one of the great founding fathers. At the center of your talk today was the theme of John Adams's moral character and how that was absolutely essential to his being the kind of man that he was, and also to his playing the role that he did in the American Revolution. And you mentioned the importance of this period after he had graduated from Harvard College, where he's a school teacher. He has some time on his hands, and he's engaged in a great deal of self-study and soul-searching, and in fact deciding who he's going to be and what kind of mark he wants to make on the world. What was he like as a young man at this point in his life?
Yeah, well, he was a very intense young man who was clearly struggling to find his way in the world, struggling to, in part, separate himself from the ambitions of his family, who wanted him to be a Calvinist minister. So after he graduated from Harvard, he took 3 years, went to Worcester, Massachusetts, where he was a school teacher in a one-room schoolhouse. And he used those 3 years first to essentially break away from five-point Calvinism, and more importantly, then to determine where he wanted to go with his life. And it was clear that from the earliest moment, John Adams had great ambition. He wouldn't be satisfied, certainly not as a school teacher, but he wouldn't even be satisfied as a lawyer in provincial Massachusetts. He had much greater ambition. So we see Adams in his diary commenting that he wanted to be a great statesman, similar to the great statesmen in 18th century England, and even going further and wanting to be a lawgiver or a founder of a nation, which if you think about it in the context of the time, this is in the British North American colonies in the 1750s, you've got this young man who's wanting to be the founder of a nation and thinking in terms of Solon and Lycurgus, the two great lawgivers of ancient Greece. So that was essentially he had this very inflated ambition for himself, but he also understood that having the ambition, the goal, the purpose was insufficient, that he had to train himself, particularly as a young man who had grown up as the first son of a provincial farmer, that his prospects were not great, and that he didn't have great means. Certainly he did not have great financial means to succeed in the world, and he understood that he, in effect, had to train himself intellectually and morally to, in effect, be greater than the station to which he was born in life. And so what's fascinating is we see in his diary a young man now who's 20, 21, 22 years old, who's struggling, one, to understand who he is, and most of all trying to develop essentially the virtues of self-governance that would be required to achieve his ambitions in life. So we see these moments in his diary when he's imploring himself, to stop, being lazy, stop spending time with young ladies, to get back to the books, and he tells himself, you've got to get down and you've got to read the great law books. You've got to read the great philosophers, the great historians, and you can't, as he says in the diary, don't let one moment pass where you're not trying to improve who you are and what you are. So during this 3-year period, it really was, as you said, a time of great soul searching, but more than just soul searching. It's a time when he's trying to make himself into a certain kind of man. It's a moment not only of self-governance, but a moment of self-creation. when he's trying to, in his own words, to conquer his passions and to develop the virtues that are necessary to achieving great things in this world.
And at this time, he's also become extraordinarily well-read in law, in history, and philosophy as a result of this act of self-creation, right, as you're putting it here. One of the lessons he seems to have learned from his reading of law and history is, as you put it, freedom is fragile, and that liberty requires a certain sort of commitment to virtue, not just among an elite number of individuals, but more broadly speaking, among the populace. What kind of virtue does Adams come to think is essential if America is going to be a free country?
Well, I don't think there's a single virtue. I think there are several virtues, both intellectual and existential. So I would say that the most important thing, he says, is that you need to develop certain intellectual virtues first. And you do that, particularly in the context in which you've asked it, about the history of liberty and freedom. Adams says that all Americans have to study the history of freedom and the history of tyranny. And the fact of the matter is, most of European history was really the history of tyranny. And these, for Adams, history was a form of philosophy. History was philosophy put into practice. And so it was important that both he and other Americans study, in particular, English history and the history of freedom and tyranny in English history. It was also important, though, that he thought that Americans should study the great philosophers of freedom, by which he primarily meant the 17th century English political theorist Sidney, and most importantly, the works of John Locke. And so for Adams, the most important thing was you first have to understand what freedom and liberty, what they are. But then secondly, when your freedom is encroached, Adams argued, the moment your freedom is encroached, you have to identify the source of tyranny or the source of coercion against that freedom, and you must fight it. So he, very early in the revolutionary cause, constantly invokes the Latin phrase obsta principi, which is to resist first beginnings. And I mean, if you think about the American Revolution, it was remarkable in that way. And you might contrast Americans of 1765, when the Stamp Act was first passed, with, say, Americans in 2009 and what's happening in the United States today. So in 1765, the British Parliament passed the Stamp Act, which in the context of the time was not a particularly onerous tax. But what's remarkable is that Adams and his American compatriots, they reacted against it immediately, and they would not, under any circumstances, allow England to pass a tax against them without representation. So they weren't willing to let, as we would say today, they weren't willing to let anything slide. The moment they sensed any form of tyranny, the flag went up and they resisted. And it's, I think, a useful lesson for Americans today to keep that in mind as we are constantly, year in and year out, taxed and regulated in ways that would have been considered unimaginable, and certainly for a form of tyranny by the generation of John Adams and the other American founders.